Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our New York Archives Magazine online speaker series. Today, we're joined by author Bill Greer and state archivist Tom Ruller for a discussion about Bill's latest book, A Dirty Year: Sex, Suffrage, and Scandal in Gilded Age New York, which is a great title. Bill Greer has spent decades exploring New York. His novel, The Mefrau Who Saved Manhattan, portrays the city's founding as New Amsterdam. He chaired the New Netherland Institute's program to establish the New Netherland Research Center, has received the Institute's Howard Hageman Award, and has spoken on New York history throughout the Hudson Valley. Bill holds a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. Tom Ruller has been New York State Archivist since 2015. Tom began his career with the State Archives as a senior archivist in 1988. Most recently, Tom served as the Director of Operations for the Office of Cultural Education in the New York State Education Department from 2007 to 2015. Prior to his service with New York State, Tom worked as an archivist at the Alabama Department of Archives and History. Tom has been an active professional and is the author of several peer-reviewed journal articles and reviews on the use of technology in archives and the preservation of records in electronic form. He's been a consultant for several state governments and other organizations focusing on electronic records management and preservation. Tom also served as the deputy city historian in his beloved hometown of Gloversville, New York in Fulton County. So the format of this is that Tom and Bill will have a discussion about Bill's excellent book, after which we'll have a brief question and answer period. So for those of you who are watching, feel free to submit questions in the Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to as many of them as we can at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce Bill Greer and Tom Ruller.
Thank you, Josie, and thank you, Bill.
Hello, everyone. Thank you.
It's great to see you, and great to share with all of you who have tuned in today this great book. I'm just going to hold it up here. It's a phenomenal book. I think it really opens up an era in New York that hasn't been explored, and a side of New York that really hasn't been explored very well. Your book focuses on 1872. That's the dirty year. It's really interesting. But why did you choose 1872 to write about? What first intrigued you about 1872?
Well, the truth is I had a model of the type of book I wanted to write. I've always been really interested in books that painted a picture of an intrinsically interesting place that at a particular point in time, something that was special about it, a tumultuous period or something like that. I have a long list of them. I'll give you some examples just to give you the flavor. Eric Larson's The Devil in the White City about 1890s Chicago. Gary Christ has one about turn of the 20th century New Orleans called Empire of Sin. There's one about New York I'll mention. It's by Matthew Goodman. It's called The Sun and the Moon, and it's about 1835 Manhattan. So I had a model in my mind of what I wanted to write. And 1872 offered up all the critical ingredients. First of all, it was 7 years after the Civil War. That was a period of great social upheaval, which I can argue culminated in 1872 in a number of ways. Secondly, it's a fascinating cityscape. I get to paint it from the Battery all the way up to Central Park and talk about all kinds of great neighborhoods, great interesting things. So that was an attraction. The public during 1872 was entranced by several larger than life characters. And I wanted to write a character-driven drama, so that was the most critical component. And you'll meet some of the characters later in this discussion. On top of that, many of the social issues of 1872 that were really concerning to society mirror the issues of today. And I think some of those will come out in the discussion. I don't directly make a connection between those issues of 1872 and today in the book, but I think many readers will recognize it, and I think that just makes the story a little more interesting. And then finally, there are conflicts that occur throughout the book in the lives of the major characters that in 1872 explode in the greatest sensation of the 19th century. I'm not the only one that thinks that. I can argue it's really true. You might hear it. It involves the most famous man in America. It's not the president of the United States. We'll get into that a little bit more, but that made it really exciting. And when it all came together, it's a story where I can make the city itself one of the characters.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. It really was a period of social upheaval, and a lot changed, and I think you started this, the Civil War changed the country tremendously. And as you talk about, explosive growth and change right after the war. And then, of course, 1873 results in, it's the beginning of the Great Depression. Not
Yes.
that happened in the 30s, but the Great Depression that was in everyone's memory up until then.
Right. And the book does, in fact, go into 1873.
Right. It does. The epilogue is one, but I'll get to that in a few minutes.
Yeah.
You've talked about the social upheaval that occurred during this time. So what are we talking about when we talk about social upheaval in 1872?
Well, if you look at the 7 years after the Civil War, it's really a period where there's a transformation in social mores. The rules that govern societal behavior, so to speak, are essentially cast aside. I characterize it as a period of sexual revolution. And the New York Times on New Year's Day, 1872, ran an editorial which sort of sets the stage. The editors bewailed a decadence in the tone of society that was taking hold. There were many chroniclers of the period who described a social order thrown into chaos. Young people were flooding into the city. It was a newfound freedom for them. It was the first time they'd ever been away from home, both men and women. The men faced many temptations that they had not had before. I'll give you some examples. Some of these are from a study by the YMCA from 1868, which was really concerned about what was happening to these men's behavior. They wanted to replace these temptations with good Christian activities. So they compiled this detailed report. Believe it or not, the start of the report was the billiard tables in New York. They counted exactly 653 billiard tables in the saloons of New York and another 11,700 odd in private homes. Wasn't the sport of billiards that was bad, it was the gambling around the table. Okay. There were gambling halls, they were called gambling hells at the time, where a young man could lose his money. There were concert saloons. The YMCA was particularly concerned about the 223 of them they counted in New York, with 20 of them on 7 blocks of Broadway. The issue there was the pretty waiter girls, which totaled 1,191 in the YMCA's opinion. And they were happy to take a cut for each drink they could pour down a man's throat and steer him to the Keno table to lose his money. The YMCA asserted that nearly one of them was a prostitute, but they went further. They identified 730 brothels around the city, employing exactly 3,417 women. They went on to describe filthy books a man could buy for 60 cents, flashy newspapers, all kinds of things. So that was one picture of it. Another picture is the women. Women had a much harder time to survive. They were flooding into the city too than the men. They took jobs as shop girls, clerks, factory hands, seamstresses, that sort of thing. They made as little as $2 a week. Even at those paltry wages, it was not unusual for their employee to steal their wages. The consequence of that was that the boarding houses turned them away as undesirables, likely to miss the rent. So it was not at all unusual for a handsome man offering comfort and security to tempt a woman, get her into trouble, and abandon her. And you'll meet a number of them in the book. I'll give you one quick example. Her name's Emma Couch. She was a young woman who moved to the city from Connecticut. she took up residence at a school for young kids, and she got a job teaching youngest ones the alphabet. She was a very respectable young lady. She went to church every Sunday. But one Sunday, the preacher invited her into his vestry and seduced her. That wasn't the end of it. They apparently had a protracted affair. And when she turned up pregnant, the preacher decided that the children his wife was raising at home were sufficient. He sent her off to Bleecker Street to get an abortion. So that's the sort of situation many women faced. And it wasn't that I'm sort of talking about the masses, the working class, the boarding house precincts, but it extended up the social ladder. What was called the fashionable set. The families were described as chasing extravagances that ate up every cent of income. The ladies returned home from the shopping with wistful disquiet on their faces because they were watching the neighbors, trying to figure out how they, could keep up with them. The mothers were described as interested in social activities rather than tending the children. Couples were said to be as likely to seek pleasure outside the wedding vows as in. So this sort of just gives you the flavor of the social transformation. And you see many of examples of it play out in the book. You also see the reactionary backlash against it.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the really great parts of your book is it makes very real the context of that women had to operate and live within during that time. Divorce was basically inaccessible except through adultery. So many women were trapped in very difficult relationships, and men in many cases preyed upon, especially these young women who had no opportunity or very limited opportunities and were forced to work in a very restricted environment. A couple of your characters, I'll just throw Victoria Woodhall out there because she's going to, I'm sure later, really worked hard to challenge those strictures and those limitations that women, especially young women, were forced into. And your book really humanizes those stories. And we talk about the laws and the regulations and all of that that are apparent in records, but these are the real stories of real people who are affected positively, negatively, or otherwise by those social mores and efforts to change them. So it's wonderful. You started talking about the social ladder, and your story ranges across the entire city. Now, of course, this is New York City in 1872, so there's no Brooklyn Bridge. It's a little more difficult to get around. There's no subway. There's no IRT. So, there's a bunch of scenes down in Five Points and down in the Bowery, and then you go up Fifth Avenue. So, how does the cityscape fit into the story that you?
Well, I think it's the cityscape is an intrinsic part of a story, of any story, and I think it was really incumbent upon me to the cityscape. It's fun to paint. I paint it all the way from the Battery up to Central Park. I'm going to give you a couple of examples of how I use it. I try to paint the cityscape through the characters who are living there, the neighborhoods they're living in, the districts they're working in, and the like. The first example I'll give you is Wall Street. Wall Street was a man's world. A woman was not allowed on the stock exchange. It was a hive of activity during the trading day, but it was no longer a fashionable place to live. So it turned dark and dreary in the evening. I get to paint it when a particular event happens and the aftermath of it. The event is that two ladies open a brokerage house and a newspaper publishing company a few doors down from the stock exchange. The specific ladies are one of them, it's two sisters. One Tom just mentioned is Victoria Woodhall and her sister Tinny Claflin. So when I paint a picture of of Wall Street, First, it's in an uproar over these two ladies. They become known as the Queens of Finance. Then it proceeds that at one point they're living there because they're homeless. So I show it in all its dreariness in the evening. And then later on there's a crowd, blocking Broad Street because they want to come to the office of these two ladies. So it runs the gamut, but it's really interesting to describe. I mentioned Bleecker Street, Annie McCouch. Bleecker was known as New York's Little Bohemia. It had at one point been quite fashionable, but by 1872, it was a little down and out, little run down. But it was said to have retained the vibrancy of Paris. That was a nice way of saying that behavior that would not be tolerated in most of New York was perfectly acceptable to the free spirits along Bleecker Street. So that's another example. You get to see Nassau Street. Nassau Street, coming up from Wall, was compared to the Casbahs of Egypt and the Tower of Babel. It was it was said to be so crowded, not even a cat could find an empty corner to crawl into. It had all kinds of businesses, booksellers, stationers, dealer of French engravings, but from under the counter, they all sold the same thing, smut. It was the heart of America's smut industry. And it plays a role in the book. You get to meet the kingpin of the smut industry, a fellow by the name of William Haynes, and you get to meet the vice hunter, Anthony Comstock, who in 1872 is trying to crush the smut industry. So you see that, you see Printing House Square, where all the newspapers were located. It's an election year, and I characterize that as a place where the wars of the Republic were fought, because some newspapers backed the Republicans, but not necessarily the same candidate among the Republicans. One backed the Democratic bastion of Tammany Hall. Another was said to have no political views. But you see what happens there throughout the election year of 1872, and you get to understand what role those newspapers play in society. So that's a flavor of how I use the cityscape.
Great, thank you. Well, we started to talk a little bit about a couple of those characters. Victoria Woodhall is one, and you've alluded to the most famous person in America already. So maybe you could sort of walk us through who some of the main characters are.
Okay. I start the book introducing 6 main characters. And the reason I do that is because all 6 of them make the news the first 2 weeks of the year. So that's sort of the basis for starting the stories, which will flow through 1872 and into the next year. The first 2 are a pair. They're Jim Fisk and Ned Stokes. Fisk was a famous financier, a very flamboyant guy, notorious in some respects, but very popular. He was very generous to the general public and the like. He was notorious for 2 reasons. A few years earlier, he had stolen the Erie Railroad in a swindle with his partner, Jay Gould. And in doing so, they outwitted some real titans of Wall Street like Cornelius Vanderbilt, the richest man in America. Ned Stokes was his close friend. He was from a very wealthy family. He more or less lived a life of leisure. He was called a sporting gentleman in his day. When I was growing up, we would have called him a playboy. That gives you a flavor of his lifestyle. He did pretend to work. His mother gave him an oil refinery to run, but he ran it into the ground. That's how he met Jim Fisk. Jim Fisk bailed him out. Anyway, throughout much of 1871, they were involved in a very public love triangle. They both fell for this woman by the name of Josie Mansfield. And as 1872 opens, the first week of the year, the love triangle reaches its fatal conclusion. Stokes shoots Fisk. Okay. So that starts, the fallout from that plays out through the year. Fisk is dead, but he still comes into the story periodically. His wife comes into the story. And the public is fixated on Stokes. he's in Tombs, New York City's prison for much of the year. And the warden estimates that 15,000 people come in to see him while he's there, not to visit, just to get a glimpse of him. So that's two. The second two are the ones we mentioned before, the ladies on Wall Street, the queens of finance, Victoria Woodhall and her sister, Tinny Claflin. They are continuing to go about their brokerage business and publish their newspaper weekly, Woodhall and Claflin's Weekly in 1872. But Victoria Woodhall is also running for president of the United States. So as Tom alluded, she's a suffragist. She had actually revolutionized the suffrage approach a year earlier, but she's a suffragist, but she really advocates for much more than that. She believes that women need much more education and opportunity because what she calls the glorious freedom of self-support is the only way they can choose to live their own lives, as opposed to live subservient to a husband or a life of degradation and on Green Street. That's the brothel district. So she's exaggerating a little bit there, but she's correct that women just don't have the opportunity to choose how to live their own lives. On the other, she's also, however, advocating for more than just women. She really believes the working class deserves a better shake, or as she calls them, the masses toiling their lives long while a handful gather up the spoils of their work. So she's, in favor of bringing up the poor and having the rich people like at the Astors and the Vanderbilts and pay their fair share. So we're going to see her campaign play out over the year. And then Tinny Claflin we'll see some bit of her sister as well. Then the fifth one is Anthony Comstock, who I mentioned also earlier with regard to the smut industry. He was a 26-year-old dry goods salesman on Broadway when 1872 started. But dry goods were not his calling, policing morals was. And he launched what would become a 40-year career as America's leading vice hunter. Some of you may know the Comstock laws. He would launch it in 1872. At the beginning of the year, almost no one knew who he was. At the end of the year, almost everybody knew who he was. So he really made a name for himself. And then finally, the next one is William Howe. He was the preeminent counsel to the criminal element in New York. He was also an amateur Shakespearean and used all his dramatic talents to sway the jury. He didn't actually make the news in 1870 at the first 2 weeks of the year, but three of his clients did. They were abortionists locked in jail because their patients died. And they've already been through a trial, but their appeals and their lives are going to play out through the story. Okay, so it sounds like sort of an odd cast. It sounds like sort of disparate stories. You wonder how that's going to work out. But the facts of the matter are the characters and their lives intertwine throughout the year. They're not disparate stories in any way, and they culminate in this great sensation as the conflicts intertwine. Okay, so that's the key characters. We're going to pull in some other major characters. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, the suffragists, have a big role. We're going to mention the famous guy now, Henry Ward Beecher, the Reverend Henry Ward Beecher, Brooklyn's beloved preacher and the most famous man in America for his role in the abolitionist movement and the Civil War, becomes a major character in the second half of the book. You're going to meet two judges who the New York Senate is trying to impeach. You're going to meet Frederick Douglass, a former slave turned leading statesman, the most prominent Black man in America. You're going to meet Thomas Nast, the political cartoonist who has effectively brought down Boss Tweed. You're going to meet Representative Benjamin Butler, who helps the suffragists. He was a member of Congress. and his bald head was said to contain a large share of the brains in the House of Representatives. The list goes on and on. There's Henry Bergh, the founder of the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, has a little cameo. Karl Marx has a little cameo, believe it or not. And then there's a bunch of people. There's a bunch of people who you wouldn't have ever heard of, but they were prominent in their day, or they could have just been people on the street, but they are pulled into these other characters' lives.
And they are. I think your point about the interconnectedness of all of these characters, and how even Cornelius Vanderbilt plays a role with Victoria Woodhall and her sister, and how that all worked out. Even when you get to the very end of the story, I shouldn't spoil too much. So
yeah, it does. He starts with Cornelius Vanderbilt and it ends with Cornelius Vanderbilt.
Yes, it's fascinating. And the way you develop some of these characters, especially, I loved your descriptions of William Howe, and because the Shakespearean actor wannabe really comes through in the way you portray him, or he is portrayed in the book. But I think throughout the book, there's a lot of savory and unsavory characters and savory and unsavory acts, but you present those character stories through a very factual, non-judgmental retelling of the stories and how they interact with one another and what they did. How do you accomplish that as an author, to sort of take that objective perspective and represent these people and what they did?
Okay. I actually wouldn't call it objective. I'll tell you why. First of all, I think I certainly do have my biases. You're right. Some are savory, some are just scum to my mind. But I try not. I think a sharp reader can detect that a little bit, but I try to keep that out of the book. I'm not writing about what I think of these characters, whether they're good, bad, or indifferent. I have two sort of philosophies about perspective that I want to bring to the book. The first is that when, other than not bringing my own, really. The first is that when I'm writing about a particular character, I want to present that character's perspective. I want to let the reader know what that person's thinking, what they're seeing, what's motivating them to do what they do. So for example, with Victoria Woodhall, I want people to understand why she wants to run for president, what the issues she sees are, that sort of thing. And when I'm talking about Anthony Comstock, who's a complete opposite of Victoria Woodhall, their lives do tangle, and I think they despise one another. But nonetheless, I want to present Anthony Comstock's perspective. And he was a very religious guy. I don't think that made him admirable in any way, but I want to present him the way he sees himself. And it goes all the way down the line. Ned Stokes is in prison. He has his ups and downs. Sometimes he's euphoric, at times he's deeply depressed. And he communicates that, and I want to communicate it to the reader the way he communicates it. And it goes down to Emma Couch. When Emma Couch's preacher sends her off to Bleecker Street, I want you to see her on Bleecker Street, and she doesn't actually get an abortion. She looks at the guy, she says, "This guy's a quack," and runs. I want you to see that. So that's one of the two pieces of the philosophy. The other piece of the philosophy is that I want to convey to the reader the public's perspective. In one sense, it's easy to. One component of that is showing how the press presents these people to the public. So the newspapers are a huge source of material for me and enable me to do that. But I also want to, if where possible, I want to communicate to the reader how the public is receiving that information, so to speak. That's a little harder to do, but there are some ways to do it. I think you're going to ask me about sources at some point, and this is a good time to do it.
Okay. Well, you do use a wide variety of sources. The great footnotes, great endnotes, and a huge bibliography, which is great. So you used a wide variety of sources, which seem to both flesh things out and sometimes contradict one another, which give a bigger story. Can you talk a little bit about your sources?
Yeah. Okay. Let me come back to perspective when I start talking about sources. I say I try to get in each character's head and present their perspective. It's not hard to do. They tell me their stories. I'll give you two examples. Victoria Woodhall tells me her story herself through her newspaper, Woodhall and Claflin's Weekly, through the speeches she gave, she probably didn't actually write them herself, but she gave them, through letters she wrote to her friends. She participates in several suffrage conventions. And when you see what's going on, the behavior of the various players there, you can get inside people's heads that way. So she presents her story to me, and I that gives me a sense of how to communicate it to the reader. Anthony Comstock, I'll give you two more examples of this. Anthony Comstock left incredibly detailed records of his criminal investigations when he was chasing down criminals. And there's a huge amount of material there. It's actually not that interesting. It's sort of technical and factual. Okay. But he also left a diary. And his diary is lost. But there was a book written in 1927, about 5 years after he died, maybe 10. Anyway, shortly after he died, that quotes it extensively. So you can actually see what he's thinking on particular dates. You know what events are going on in his life, and you can practically hear him talking to God about what he's going to do tomorrow. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but to make a point. So he's telling me his story. He talked to the press a lot. He published a couple of books, some smaller pieces. He had an authorized biographer he told his story to. So I put those together. He tells me a story. And I could go on and on and on, but I'm going to give you one more example. The most famous man, Henry Ward Beecher. Okay. He gets caught up in a sexual scandal. That's what the sensation is. I'm not sure we've said that before. And it plays out long beyond 1872. Ultimately, Plymouth Church, he's the pastor of Plymouth Church in Brooklyn Heights, undertakes an investigation of the scandal. And they get all kinds of testimony. They collect all kinds of letters from the period leading up to 1872 and during 1872. And the investigation turns out to be a whitewash, but the evidence is all still there for me to see. And subsequent to the Plymouth investigation, there's a trial. A fellow by the name of Theodore Tilton, a member of Plymouth Church, living in Brooklyn Heights, sues Henry Ward Beecher for alienating his wife's affections. Beecher had seduced his wife, another parishioner. And this trial plays out for weeks in Brooklyn. Press from around the country is there. I describe it as the O.J. Simpson trial of the 19th century, if you remember O.J. Simpson's trial. I mean, it's a national theater. And there are 3 volumes of 1,000 pages each of the transcript of this trial. And I can tell you what Henry was doing on May 31st, 1873. I told you the book goes into that year. As the clock ticked toward midnight, and he was in a very depressed mood. He was practically suicidal. I'm not exaggerating there. I mean, literally. And I can tell you that the next morning, June 1st, he woke up with a much clearer view of where he wanted to go. He was talking about the joys of the earth. And he was just in a completely different frame of mind. He didn't actually go where he thought he was going to go, but I try to bring those sorts of perspective to Henry Ward Beecher's character when I'm talking about Henry Ward Beecher. Okay, so that's enough of that. But now I go to the other perspective. So I'm talking about sources, sort of. Then I go to the other perspective, the public perspective. Okay, I talked about using the newspapers. I can tell you, newspapers across the country covered what was going on in New York in 1872. But I also wanted to try to get the public directly, perception directly. And I did that in a couple of ways. One is there are, for example, two instances where somebody watching Victoria Woodhall give a speech, two different speeches, two different times, then recorded what they thought and went and published it in the papers. Okay. And there, on two occasions, I actually pull those people into the story, to my story, to tell what they saw Victoria Woodhull doing and how they were reacting to it. Okay. Another common source I used was there are contemporaries of the period that wrote memoirs. So there's a fellow by the name of Henry Clues, a financier on Wall Street, that has a chapter in his memoir about the lady brokers coming to Wall Street and what was going on. There's a contemporary attorney of William Howe that you were fond of, Tom, who wrote a memoir of the legal profession, and he tells how operated, what he thought, so there's a lot of material there, and so if I had to boil it, if I go back to source and boil it down to three things, it's newspapers, it's the pieces that told me specifically what people were thinking, like Victoria Woodhull's newspaper and speeches, Anthony's Comstock's diary, that sort of thing, and a lot of what contemporaries were writing about the city overall, which helped use paint the cityscape, and their contemporaries who were writing about particular aspects and particular people.
Wow. And I think I'm not going to ask you this question because I think we can go pretty far afield on it. But at the time, the newspapers recorded a huge amount of information about people, and the concepts of privacy and sharing my inside thoughts with a newspaper reporter weren't quite seemed to be as hardened as perhaps they are now. And I'm not going to ask you the question, but I'm going to put it out there for all of us to think about. Would you be able to write the same book about 1972 or 2012? Newspapers are very different. Reporting is very different. And the concepts of privacy are very different. Of course, society is very different in general, but we benefit from people writing things down and sharing what they're thinking with others who write things down or putting together their memoir. And it seems that historians like you really benefit from of course, the written word and the triangulation of multiple sources to get at the truth is why we have great books like this. So, all right, enough of my speechifying about great sources, but one of the things that we have touched on it a few times, and Victoria Woodhull is a leader in all this, but you mentioned Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and even Frederick Douglass, who was involved in the suffrage movement. Women's suffrage plays a really large role in the book. We talked a little bit about this earlier, which was more in the context of women's rights. But what was going on with women's suffrage in 1872?
Okay, to answer that question, I need to back up to the beginning of 1871. The suffrage movement had been going on for a while by then. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony were leading an organization called the National Women's Suffrage Association. I'm going to focus on this. There was a rival organization in Boston. They were labeled the New York Wing, but that'll take me too long. So they were pursuing an additional constitutional amendment after the 14th and 15th amendments that gave Black men the right to vote, or that prohibited prohibited outlawing abortion on the basis of race, among other things. And Victoria Woodhull Victoria Woodhull was not a player in the suffrage movement at all up to that point. Susan Anthony had interviewed her once as a broker on Wall Street. But in January of 1871, Victoria Woodhull was invited to speak before the House Judiciary Committee. She was the first woman ever to speak before a committee of Congress. And she laid out an argument that the Constitution already gave women the right to vote. There wasn't any need for another constitutional amendment. The 14th and the 15th Amendments did it. And I'm not going to get into the details of it. It's sort of questionable legally, but she made a good argument. And Susan B. Anthony and the rest of the suffragists bought it. Susan B. Anthony actually was invited to attend by the committee at the last minute to attend, along with some other suffrage leaders. And it was the very day that they were supposed to start their convention in Washington, D.C., but they delayed the start so they could hear Victoria Woodhull. They practically carried her on their shoulders back to the convention, and they embraced her approach. There was numerous letters lauding her. Susan B. Anthony actually went on a speaking tour with a new speech called "The New Situation," promoting this situation. The problem was that Susan B. Anthony wanted the vote, period. She was described as the vote being the nail, and she with the hammer. I want the vote, the vote, the vote, the vote. And as I said earlier, Victoria Woodhull's agenda was much broader than that. Okay, so what happens is that over 1871, Anthony pulls back, but Elizabeth Cady Stanton and some other suffragists say, no, this is the way we're going. We're backing Victoria Woodhull. And there's another convention in January of 1872 for the suffragists where Woodhull is now a major player in the movement. And as soon as it opens, it is clear that there's a split between Anthony and Stanton, the two women who we think of as joined at the hip. Okay, and the wedge in the split is Victoria Woodhull. Okay, and that convention closes with the crowd clamoring for Woodhull, and they're demanding she come back on stage as the convention is closing, and one woman stands up and says, Victoria Woodhull for president, and by acclamation, she is nominated. It's not really a formal process, but they're saying we want her for president. Let's nominate her. And Anthony is like, no. Stanton has a right to claim it, and I have a right to claim it. All these other people are head of the line before Victoria Woodhull, but it's pandemonium. So the split just grows over time. And in May, there's another convention of the suffragists. By this time, Stanton and Anthony are practically at each other's throats, but they're still both there. Woodhull's not allowed on the stage. But as the first evening closes, Woodhull's in the audience. The crowd again starts clamoring for Victoria Woodhull as she sort of glides onto the stage. And pandemonium begins. It gets so bad that Anthony goes to the janitor and tells him to turn off the gas lights. 100 lights in this auditorium shut down, and you can just picture people groping for the exits. So it just fell apart. And so Anthony wants the three political parties to put a suffrage plank in. The reason there are three is because there's a split among the Republicans. Some back Grant and some back Horace Greeley. But basically they all refuse to put anything in about the suffrage movement. The Republicans put some plank in that, we thank the women for, there's our support. And, if any group wants more rights, we'll give it a listen, something to that. So you put it all together, Anthony goes home and is just depressed. And the suffrage, she patches things up with Stanton, but she's depressed. Nothing much is going to happen to suffrage for a while. But it's the first time that Anthony has been back at home in Rochester, New York for 30 days before an election, because she's always out on election tour. And the residency requirement in New York State is that you're home in your election district for 30 days before the election. So she says, I'm going to vote. And she goes down with her sisters, and it ends up being some other women. She goes down to the local barbershop. That's where you register to vote. It's also where you're going to vote, right? Sounds a little strange to me, but so she tells the 3-member board of inspectors, is this where you vote? Because I want to register myself. And the chair of the board says, no, you're a woman. You're not allowed to register under New York State law. Mm-hmm. And she says, do you know anything about the 14th Amendment? So they start arguing, and pretty soon she talks 2 of them into it. And the third one objects, but he finally comes around. So she gets to register. All she wanted to do was get refused so she could raise it in court, So she's a few days later, Tuesday, first Tuesday of November, she goes back to the barbershop. She says, I'm here to vote. Guy says, no, you're a woman. You can't vote. So she starts arguing again, and she convinces 2 of them. And on election day, it's a majority rule. So the third one finally comes around. Okay, vote. She gets her ballots. She marks them. She folds them in half, hands them over. She sees them get stuffed in the ballot box. Anonymous ballots in the ballot box. They're going to get counted, right? Only one. So she's ecstatic. She goes home. She writes Stanton, I'm so tired. I've been running for 5 days, but I finally did it. I voted. And there's only one problem. At the end of November, the marshal shows up at her house to arrest her.
Yep.
You can find out what happens after that. It goes on for months. It's in the book, but she has a trial. I mean a trial in life. I don't mean it. She also has a trial in court.
Right.
That's
there are a lot of trials,
Yeah.
You got the Woodhall's trial. You've got Henry Ward Beecher's trial. You got Susan B. Anthony's trial, all around the same time.
Yeah.
So it's fascinating. You said something about, and I'm sorry for focusing so much on Victoria Woodhall, but she's, to me, her character really is a central one throughout the entire book. She was a very powerful orator, and your descriptions of, and just what you just said now, she really brought the crowds in, and they clamored to hear more from her. But you suggested that she was not her own speechwriter. She was good at delivery, but there was the content written by her. Or?
That's like saying Obama wasn't his speechwriter.
Okay.
Okay. I mean it in that sense. I think most of her speeches were written by a guy by the name of Stephen Pearl Andrews, who did a lot of the work at Woodhall and Claflin's Weekly.
Okay.
But she was putting his words in his mouth. She was on his piece of paper. He wasn't putting words in hers. But she was uneducated. She didn't have. She grew up her parents took her around the country in their, almost there's corrupt theater act. They put her out on the stage as a clairvoyant. So she wasn't educated in that sense, but she was a mesmerizing speaker. She said, and I told you, I gave you the view in the book of people that actually saw her speak, that she claimed that the spirits overtook her, and it was true, and she, even after 1872, she has a remarkable career for the next 4 or 5 years as one of, if not the leading woman on the lecture circuit, which is a big form of entertainment back then. And by the end of that, the newspapers are calling her the most remarkable woman in the world, or in America, maybe the world, the best known woman in America. She's become the Henry Ward Beecher, so to speak.
Yeah. Great. Bill, there seem to be a lot of parallels between 1872 and today.
Yep.
And can you talk a little bit about what you see is what some of those parallels might
Yep.
be?
I'm going to tell you, I'm going to start with the ones that have already appeared in the book, that I mean, in our discussion, okay? We talked about Emma Couch and Henry Ward Beecher, sexual impropriety, the Me Too movement, sexual impropriety at the highest levels of business and politics. We see it today. That's number one, okay? Number two, I'm trained as an economist, believe it or not. And so I know something about economics. We have got this giant chasm between the rich and poor that has grown enormously since I was in college. That's a statistical fact. You heard Woodhall talking about the working classes, toiling while the few rich people gathered o'er the spoils. It was a big issue there. We've sort of touched on abortion. That plays out through the book. We haven't talked about birth control, but it's illegal. The smut dealers, they're both smut dealers and doctors that sell the 19th century equivalent of condoms and diaphragms. They were called womb veils then. And Anthony Comstock's going after them just like the smut dealers. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But there was big battle over reproductive rights. We see it today. There's, battles over birth control access with insurance, obviously abortion. So that was a big issue. In the election of 1872, the newspapers, the Republican-backed newspapers were charging the Democrats with electoral fraud. The Democratic newspapers were charging the Republicans with fraud. There's actually a little piece on election day in New York City. There's practically no fraud, right? Yeah, I mean, there would have been in the past, but Boss Tweed's machine is taking a dive here. What do you see today? Charges of electoral fraud, aimed at disenfranchising voters. There is a lot of, there are several times in 1872 in the book where you see racism that existed in, okay? Racial injustice, huge issue right now. I got to actually list here. I think I've got them all now. One more. We see mass shootings today, major problem in society, big arguments over guns. In 1872, the New York papers were calling the city a paradise for murderers. So there was a big problem there. So, that's 6 or 7 issues that are directly parallel. Let me stop there.
Okay.
Did you ask me the next question?
A reminder to all of us that those who neglect history are unfortunately bound to repeat it. So I guess one last one here, because we've got to wrap it up soon. Yeah. But and wasn't there a pandemic that year?
Yes, there was a pandemic. I was wondering you were going to ask me that. It wasn't quite the pandemic we have now. You mentioned earlier there were no subways, there were no cars. Right. What was the power source in New York? It was horses, right? They pulled the streetcars, they pulled the Hansons, they moved all the freight around the city. In October of 1872, there was an epidemic of horse distemper. Less than a month before the election day, the city shut down. The horse cars lines the horses were dropping dead in the street. Okay. And the horse car lines shut down. Before the horse car lines shut down, you had conductors pulling the horse cars. I mean, there are pictures of conductors pulling the horse cars. And Printing House Square, where the newspapers were, was a huge, lively area. It was empty. The Central Park Carriage Parade, every day at 4 o'clock, there was a parade of the rich and wealthy. Wasn't a horse to be seen, right? And so, everybody's going, it wasn't just in New York, it was sort of in the Northeast. And everybody's sitting there, wow, what are we going to do? The good news was that when the horses didn't drop dead in the streets, got back to the stable and a doctor or veterinarian got a hold of him, they recovered. So the facts of the matter are, before election day, the horse cars reopened and the city came back to life. So it didn't actually disrupt the election. But it's just sort of it's not actually even in the book, but it's ironic to think that there was a pandemic then, just as there's a pandemic now.
Yeah. Wow. Well, and the image, we see the image of 1918 and city streets being empty. But of course, there's no photography, but the images of New York in 1873 and 1872, having empty streets is amazing to think about that as well. Josie, have we gotten in? Do we have any time for a couple of questions from our audience, or are we just about wrapped up?
We have a couple more minutes in case there are questions from the audience. So now would be a good time for people who are listening to submit your questions if you have some. I have one, if you don't mind. What was your sort of source moment, like the one thing you came across that changed your whole perspective, or the aha moment, or the one thing that really gave you an insight into a character that you hadn't had before? Just one. There's always that moment. What was yours?
The character would be Victoria Woodhall. And I will tell you that I really got interested in this period through Anthony Comstock and a woman by the name of Madame Restell, who was the city's abortionist to the high class. She was known as the wickedest woman in New York. But as I started looking into the pair of them, Victoria Woodhall, I found Victoria Woodhall through Anthony Comstock. And she was the fascinating character to me. I mean, she was she was an unbelievable person to run across in that era to me. And she just stood out from everybody. She did extraordinary things. She was vilified by society in many respects. And I said, that's a character I want to play with.
And did you see her best through her speeches, or what were the sources that gave you the most insight into who she was?
I saw her best through what she did. I wouldn't say there's a single thing. I mean, I guess if you got right down to it, it was the fact that she went to Wall Street when she did was extraordinary. And then she started a newspaper. And when she started the newspaper, you could just see a lot of her thoughts. She also then very quickly she opened the brokerage firm in February of 1870. And in March, I think, or May, she wrote a letter to the New York Herald announcing her presidential candidacy. And, she described, sort of who she was and why she was doing this. And it was extraordinary that somebody would have the vision and ambition that a woman would have the vision and ambition to do that in that era. And I just thought she was phenomenal.
And the nerve. Okay, we do have one question. So one of our participants has said she really enjoyed learning all of the details of this time period. Are you planning on writing another book that continues the story, or is a spin-off from it? There's a lot here that you could spin off from.
I'm not planning on it. You can go to my website, billsbrownstone.com, and find a lot of what I'll call outtakes from the book. So I suggest you do that. I'm actually looking at writing another book about New York in the 1919 to 1921 period, which was also a post-war period, a lot of tumultuous activities, prohibition. I'm looking at I'm looking at an aspect right now where 5 socialists were elected to the New York Assembly in November 1919, and they got up to Albany, and the powers that be in Albany refused to seat them and ultimately expelled them. And I just, that's the sort of interesting, there's a lot to it, but it's an interesting, piece of New York history that I don't think is that well known. It might be interesting to write about, for example.
I look forward to that story, even if it's a short story. Bill Greer, you have opened our eyes. You've taught us a lot about not just one year in New York, but a lot of people and a lot of major themes that resonate today and will resonate tomorrow. Thank you very much for this gift of this great book, A Dirty Year by Bill Greer. You can find it on Amazon, and it's very well worth reading. It's very well researched, and as we've seen today, it's very interesting.
And I will offer, you can buy, if you go to my website, billsbrownstone.com, you'll find a lot more material on this aspect of New York, but on New York in general. But more importantly, you can find a number of places to buy the book. If you want to buy it from your local bookstore, you can go to indiebooks.org. The publisher's offering a big discount of 30%, which you can find the information on how to get that discount on my website. Just click on the book cover when you get to the homepage. So I hope you buy it, and I hope you enjoy it.
That's great. Thank you so much. It's such a feat to be able to weave together all those storylines. It's really amazing. Thank you so much for being here with us today. And
thank all of you for listening.
Thank you for leading our discussion today. And to all of you out there in the audience, be sure to tune in for our next online speaker series at 12:30, same time, on Tuesday, November 10th, where we'll be celebrating the completion of the Save America's Treasures grant project from the National Park Service and the Institute of Museum and Library Services that helped the New York State Archives conserve and digitize historical court records and other important documents of the Revolutionary War era. State Archivist Tom Ruller will be joining us again, along with Dr. James Foltz, who is the head of researcher services at the New York State Archives. And they'll lead a conversation with renowned historian of colonial and revolutionary America, Dr. Edward Countryman, about the importance of these newly digitized records. If you're interested, you can visit our website at www.nyarchivestrust.org to learn more. Thanks again to our panelists today. It was such a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you to those of you who tuned in.